And of course, my executive assistant, Jim Colford, as well. Barring no other member statements, we'll prepare for oral questions put by members to ministers, which will commence momentarily. On this cool, crisp day of October the 26th. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Parents woke up this morning to the news that a 96% strike vote has been taken by teachers. What a colossal mess this government has made of their negotiations with teachers. Mr. Speaker, for the first time in our province's history, we may well face a province-wide strike. Governments are expected to work these things out at the table, Mr. Speaker, and yet for the first time we have a government that has not been able to do that. So I'd like to ask the Premier, what is the plan to resolve this standoff now?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Mr. Speaker, we as a government have negotiated two separate agreements with two different NSCU executives. They were both rejected by their membership. Yesterday, their membership gave a strong mandate to the union for a strike vote. We will continue to monitor the situation, Mr. Speaker, but we're also going to continue to focus on what we've been doing, which is the classroom. We're going to continue to make those investments, working with classroom teachers across this province, Mr. Speaker, to continue what we believe is to improve the classroom and learning environment.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, no wonder parents and students and teachers are so worried. The Premier just said they plan to do nothing. That's what monitoring the situation really means, nothing, Mr. Speaker. In fact, last night, he and his Minister of Education said it's up to the union now what to do. Well, that's not leadership, Mr. Speaker, and this province needs leadership. It's the government that messed this up. It's the government that can show leadership and get this back on track. Even spokespeople for the union say they don't want to strike. They want to work on classroom improvements. And I will quote from Wally Fyander, a teacher spokesperson, who said, let's get back to the table, and hopefully they'll take us seriously instead of just giving us lip service. So will the Premier now get back to the table and put serious classroom reforms on that table instead of just giving the union lip service?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. The union asked to have reduced class sizes, Mr. Speaker. We have hired over 500 teachers to reduce class sizes across the entire elementary school. Mr. Speaker, we were asked to reduce outcomes. We brought teachers in from across the province to work with them to reduce those outcomes. We're continuing to hire more math mentors, Mr. Speaker. We've hired more mental health clinicians in schools. Mr. Speaker, we have said all along we're willing and continuing to work to improve the classroom environment. We said we're prepared to sit down and talk to teachers about that. As a matter of fact, the minister has asked teachers to come and join her along with school board members to continue to improve the learning environment. But it doesn't help, Mr. Speaker, when the Leader of the Opposition continues to fearmonger in this House day after day after day. And, Mr. Speaker, he is never right with his predictions, unfortunately for Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I know that when the Premier is flustered and when he's frustrated, he tries to lash out at others. But that is not the leadership that Nova Scotians want. That's not what they expect of their Premier, Mr. Speaker. Instead of showing Nova Scotians a way out of the mess, he resorts to his usual talking points, which no one is believing anymore. He says he's listening to teachers, while 96% of them said last night that they are not being heard, Mr. Speaker. And the parents and students that rely on those classrooms to be functional and working are not going to get any comfort from what this Premier just said. So I would like to ask him, why should parents and students and teachers trust him now after he created this mess in the first place and refuses to go back to the table and put real classroom improvements back in play?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we've said all along along. We're continuing to talk with teachers, talk with the union to improve the classroom environment. What has become very clear, Mr. Speaker, what the union executive has proposed as solutions that they believe classroom teachers learn obviously wasn't accurate. We've responded to everything that's been brought to us. We'll continue to work with classroom teachers across this province to make sure that we improve the learning environment. Of all of the challenges that this province has been facing and the government has had to deal with, the one place, Mr. Speaker, we've continued to invest has been in education across this province, and we will continue to invest in education.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, my question is also to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, yesterday was a historic day. 9,300 members of the Nova Scotia Teacher Union voted overwhelmingly in favour of a strike mandate, a statement that the union said no teacher wants a strike. But teachers are willing to fight to deliver the best education for Nova Scotia students, and I'll table this document. Mr. Speaker, there has never been a province-wide teacher strike in the history of this province, but the actions of this government has brought us to the brink. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier agree to go back to the table to negotiate in good faith with the teachers?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, what has brought us to this point is the previous government cut $65 million out of education, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Order. Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, what has brought us to this point is the previous government cut $65 million out of education, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what we've done over the last 3 years is continue to reinvest, Mr. Speaker, that $65 million back into education. We reinstated Read and Recovery, a program that they cut, Mr. Speaker. We're continuing, and we know there's more work to do, and we're continuing and wanting to work with classroom teachers. That's why the minister has reached out to the union. The union has accepted school board members. They'll sit down, look at how they continue to improve the classroom. Mr. Speaker, we presented dates to the union. We're waiting to hear back from them.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this Premier is stuck in the past. It's about the future for our children. Mr. Speaker, the Premier keeps telling us about the steps this government has taken to address the issues in education. Well, Mr. Speaker, I think it's pretty clear that the government's plan is not working. Yesterday, the NSTU president again said that teachers have not been consulted on the changes that the government has made. So I asked, Mr. Speaker, I asked the Premier, does he agree to listen to the teachers and start working together to resolve these issues?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we've continued to listen to teachers across the province. Mr. Speaker, as you would know, and the honourable member should know, the vehicle to listen to teachers is the NSTU. When we've tried to reach out directly to teachers, the NSTU has called the minister before the Labour Board saying we've circumvented the union, Mr. Speaker. We would love nothing more than to have a town hall with teachers across this province and continue to work with them, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue to make sure that we focus on the classrooms across this province.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, it's time for this Premier to take responsibility for the situation he has created. The main issue in this dispute are poor working conditions and attempt to negotiate under a dark cloud of Bill 148. So far, neither the Premier nor any minister has ruled out using this.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party has the floor.
Okay. You want me to start over, Mr. Speaker? Go ahead. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, it is time for the Premier to take responsibility for the situation he has created. The main issue in this dispute are poor working conditions, the attempting to negotiate under the dark cloud of Bill 148. So far, neither the Premier nor the ministers has ruled out using this heavy-handed legislation to dictate to a contract for the teachers. So, Mr. Speaker, will the Premier please tell Nova Scotians if he plans to enact this legislation or if this government is in fact willing to negotiate in good faith?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, Bill 148 actually responds to arbitrations. Teachers do not have arbitration, Mr. Speaker, at this point. The honourable member should know that, Mr. Speaker. And he's absolutely right, Mr. Speaker, we've continued to work with classroom teachers across this province to make investments in classrooms across the province. We're going to continue to do so, to listen to teachers to make sure we make those investments. We're going to continue to work with citizens across this province to make sure, Mr. Speaker, that our children get the proper beginning in education, to give them the opportunities all of us have had, Mr. Speaker. And it's plain and simple. We knew, and we watched the previous government cut their way in education, and we knew that wasn't the way to go, Mr. Speaker. We've taken a new path. We're going to continue to work with, and we're going to continue to work with teachers.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development. 96% of Nova Scotia teachers have sent a clear message to the government. The classroom supports have not caught up to classroom demands. I've heard from classroom teachers, and they feel the talking points being used by the Premier and the Minister of Education are not all entirely factual. They do not tell the complete story. The Premier said in this House and in the media that 500 teachers have been hired since 2013. That fact may be accurate, Mr. Speaker. However, I wonder what the net increase is. My question to the Minister, can the Minister put that number into meaningful context and tell this House how many teachers have actually retired since 2013?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite. I'm really glad that he's raised that question, because people are misunderstanding what a replacement teacher and what a retirement teacher really means. And when boards do their staffing, they do their staffing based on their enrollment. When we cap the class sizes, we go in and say, how many more teachers do you need to implement the cap? They tell us, we fund it. So it is absolutely in addition to any other staffing that the boards would have made prior to implementing the cap.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
Order, please.
Thank you, former Speaker. An update report of the Nova Scotia Public Education Teacher Supply and Demand from August 2012, more specifically Appendix 3, outlines the retirement and disability assumptions for the teacher pension plan. I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. It lays out the number of teachers who are eligible to retire with or without an unreduced pension. For 2013 to 2016, it totals 1,291 teachers, 1,291. If they have all retired, then Nova Scotia is actually facing a 791 teacher deficit under this Premier's mandate. Question, will the Minister please tell the House how many more teachers must be hired in order to just break even with 2013 when this government took power, keeping in mind the decrease in student enrollment?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I guess if we're talking new math, that probably is the first version of that. However, I will repeat, Mr. Speaker, that when the classes in our schools were capped, the numbers of teachers that were needed to do that were identified by the boards, and when those numbers came to the department, the total number of positions needed to implement the cap were funded above and beyond the funding formula that had already been applied.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, when teachers voted yesterday, they spoke with one voice. Teachers are united in their concerns about the learning and teaching environment in schools across this province. They're buried under the weight of entering data into cumbersome systems, and they want more quality time with students to get to know their strengths and learn how to support their needs. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm hearing from teachers that the Minister's action plan has failed to improve the situation in classrooms right across this province. So is she willing to take a step back from her ill-advised action plan and start including the Nova Scotia Teachers Union in her decision-making?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would remind all members of the House that there have been attempts made from my office to teachers to find out what their real concerns were. And 2 times those attempts have been blocked. And if I could, Mr. Speaker, I will read to you a letter that I received from the Teachers Union when we wanted to have focus groups of teachers to let them tell us what their concerns were. And, Mr. Speaker, the answer back was, I respectfully request that you cancel the focus groups scheduled for teachers, signed by the President of the Teachers Union, and I will table that.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Mr. Speaker, well, I'm very disappointed to hear that, because what I'm hearing from teachers is that they feel this government is not listening to them and this minister is not listening to them. And they ask, when was the last time she taught in a classroom? The minister says she kept classes. Well, teachers say their classrooms are still overcrowded. She says she hired teachers. Teachers say that schools are still underfunded and understaffed. She says she increased supports. Teachers say they're not able to service the number of IPP programs and adaptations in the classrooms. So, Mr. Speaker, I'll table some of the stories teachers have been sharing with me, but the minister is asking teachers to do more with less. So my question today is, what is this minister going to bring to the table today to show the teachers that this government respects the contributions that they're making in the classrooms right across this province?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, in response, I guess perhaps in response to that, I do want to say that teachers have legitimate concerns. We have tried to provide an opportunity for the teachers' voices to be heard. We have learned, unfortunately, that the Teachers Union does not speak for the teachers. We went out to teachers and asked them, what are your needs for professional development? We developed a survey for teachers so they could tell us what their needs were. And the answer back from the union, and I will read it, the NSTU asks for a commitment that the department will not rely upon the results of a survey with respect to professional development, and further, that the department will destroy all results collected from teachers. The NSTU further asks that teachers who have not yet completed the survey will not do so. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education.
Order, please. The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, my question is, how many teachers have retired since 2013?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd be glad to get that information for the member.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the teachers that I've been talking to have been getting conflicting messages. The minister, in one hand, is saying, we want to talk to you and we'll provide the resources and funding for your classrooms. Come to our table and we'll handle it. On the other hand, the Premier is saying there will be no more funding. Would the minister clarify that?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
And Mr. Speaker, I have no idea what the member said, but perhaps the Premier could answer it.
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question, because every budget that I've introduced in this House, Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud of the fact that I put more money in classrooms across this province. What I said, Mr. Speaker, and I want to be clear, that we will treat every public servant the same, Mr. Speaker, and when it comes to the benefit package, Mr. Speaker, all the money that we have is on the table. I would be happy they identify the issues in the classroom to invest more money over and above what we've already invested in classrooms across this province, Mr. Speaker, because I believe in teachers and I want to give children the right start in life, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
That means you're going back to the table. There you go.
Order, please. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Okay. Not your other chair.
Mr. Speaker, The Continuing Care Council went public this week to say that our nursing home providers across the province are struggling with the 1% cuts that the Premier has imposed on their budgets. The Continuing Care Council represents 90% of the licensed nursing homes in Nova Scotia. They wanted to make it clear that the cuts that they are forced to use are, in fact, impacting the residents that live there, Mr. Speaker, our seniors. So I'd like to ask the Premier, is he going to stick to his usual talking points about how his cuts are not impacting residents, or will he now finally take the words of the people that actually provide care to our seniors in nursing homes and work with them to restore the funding?
The Honourable Premier.
Again, I want to thank the honourable member for the questions. As I said, if he'd been here, Mr. Speaker, 4 executive directors that were in the House this day said it was not impacting patient care.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, once again, I'll have to say that is not what they said. Nobody comes here to say everything is fine. The Premier must know that by now. He's been here a long time. The organization representing 90% of the nursing homes of this province says it's unreasonable to expect them to take another 1% out of their entire budget when the amount of costs they can actually cut is limited to a very few things like food quality, Mr. Speaker. So will the Premier admit once and for all that his cuts are impacting the quality of care, including food, in our nursing homes, and reverse those cuts?
The Honourable Premier.
I thank the honourable member who continually comes to this House to spread fear, Mr. Speaker. I was grateful for the fact that we had 4 executive directors come to this House to actually dispute what he was saying when they said it was not impacting food quality, Mr. Speaker. That was from the very people who are running 4 of our institutions across this province. What we have said to them, or if there are other issues associated with delivering services, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Health has reached out. What they were talking to, and I listened to them, they were talking about future budgets. The Minister continued to work with them. They talked about emergency repairs. We've talked about that with the Minister. We're continuing to work with our partners. But it does not help, Mr. Speaker, when the Leader of the Opposition continually, day after day, comes to this House and does nothing else but stir up fear among our citizens.
The Honourable House Leader for the new... Pardon me. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know when the Premier gets confused, he lashes out at others who bring facts to this House that disagree with his talking points, but that is no way to actually make sure that our seniors get the help that they need. In fact, Mr. Speaker, beyond the 1% cut, the people who actually run our nursing homes have said that his government has turned down every single request for even the most modest capital improvements to the nursing homes of the province, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Premier, why is he refusing to upgrade, even at the most basic level, the province's nursing homes when it affects our seniors so obviously?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Again, I want to thank those workers across the province who continue to look after our seniors, Mr. Speaker. The 4 executive directors that came into this House, Mr. Speaker, talked about the fact that there were challenging times, but the fact that the 1% cut was not affecting patient care, nor was it affecting food quality. We've said to them, we continue to reach out. The Minister through the Department has reached out if there are issues around investments that be required in their facilities. That's an ongoing process that happens. And, Mr. Speaker, we're all now in the process of looking at budgets for next year, and I know the Minister will be engaging those developers.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, nursing home operators are speaking up. They say they can't handle the 1% cut because it's forced them to cut things like the quality of food. They say they can't handle no funding for even the most modest improvements to the nursing homes themselves, Mr. Speaker. When they bring those concerns forward like Northwood did, rather than listen to them, the Premier sends the auditors, Mr. Speaker. It's an attempt to silence our nursing home operators who are trying to do the right thing for their residents. So I'd like to ask the Premier, when he's confronted with obvious needs, why does he try and silence them by sending in the auditors to those that speak up instead of listening to the voices of the nursing home operators across this province who are trying to provide decent care for our seniors?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, the honourable member is spreading misfact and fear in the province of Nova Scotia. It's completely inaccurate. The very people who run those nursing homes, 4 of them were here, said the changes have not impacted food quality. He continues to stand up to fear among our citizens, Mr. Speaker. It's completely unacceptable for someone who's trying to aspire to be the Premier that he thinks the only way he can get there is to spread fear and inaccurate information. Fact of the matter is, the 4 people that were in this house said it did not affect food quality, Mr. Speaker, and Mr. Speaker, and the ones that we've reached out to said it has not impacted food quality. Are other issues that we need to continue to do? Of course. And I want to go further, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member raised the issue of the auditor, which was agreed to by both facilities. One is a not-for-profit nursing home. There is a profit facility. We had a different number. We agreed on someone to come in to look at it, to come to what would be the proper conclusion. That's what a good government should do, Mr. Speaker. Listen to people, find solutions, find common ground.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question's for the Premier. The uncertainty created by last night's teachers' vote is particularly concerning to students at the province's schools. Many of these students have written MLAs to express their support for teachers and concern for their own education. Regardless of who the government thinks is right in this dispute, no one can deny that students have been caught as innocent bystanders in this escalating war. So, Mr. Speaker, how does the Premier respond to the concerns stated by students?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. As you would know, Mr. Speaker, teachers are standing in front of students today. I believe they want to continue to stand in front of students. We want them to stand in front of students, continue to stay there. Mr. Speaker, we've come back to the table to see how we continue to improve the classroom environment. We believe there's a solution there that will help us come to a resolution of this issue. But, Mr. Speaker, students across this province and families across this province know that teachers want to be in front of their students, and they are in front of their students.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Dartmouth East resident Kenzie Donnelly was the primary author of the letter MLAs received recently, and she's with us today. And I know her as a passionate and caring young woman, and I assure this House that her concerns are genuine and from the heart. She feels teachers' concerns about the classroom issues are real, but she and many other grade 12 students are also concerned about the uncertainty that has now been created in impacting their academic year, whether that's because of a strike, work to rule, or just not knowing what will happen. So, Mr. Speaker, what does the Premier say in response to students like Kenzie who are now worried about the uncertainty might impact their education for this year?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to welcome grade 12 student from Dartmouth to the House of Assembly. I too share. Mr. Speaker, I too share the concerns that she had about the classrooms across this province. That's why from the very beginning of all the difficult challenges I have made as the Premier of this province, I've continued to invest in classrooms, whether it's class caps, whether it's reading recovery, hiring more math mentors, hiring mental health clinicians. We know there's more work to do, Mr. Speaker. I want it through her. I hope she'll take a message back to her classroom teacher to tell her how much I appreciate the work that she's doing, or he or she is doing, on behalf of her class and the citizens. We want to work with our classroom teacher to make sure that we provide them with the proper supports to make sure the learning environment is there. Because, Mr. Speaker, there are young people, just like the student that is in this gallery, who will lead this province, who will continue to move forward. The least we can do is invest in that. And, Mr. Speaker, of all the things I've done, I want to say this again. I have continued to invest in public education. Have we gotten it all right, Mr. Speaker? Obviously not. Mr. Speaker, we're continuing to work with teachers to improve that environment because I fundamentally believe that is our responsibility to give the next generation of Nova Scotians the proper start of life, and I want to support the teachers.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. In 2015, the Dalhousie Student Union organized and established a volunteer-run sexual assault and harassment phone line. The phone line was confidential, anonymous, peer support service for anyone who had been affected by sexualized or gender-based violence. This year, the phone line had to be reduced. The number of hours it's operating because the funding offered by the university administration was insufficient. So I'd like to ask the Minister, what is the Minister doing to make sure university and college students across Nova Scotia have access to the supports they need on campuses?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
I'd like to thank the honourable member for the question, and I did want to let him know that in fact now the 211 and 811 lines for the government are in fact offering services to people who have been sexually assaulted to make sure that they get the assistance that they need. We also have struck a committee over at Labour and Advanced Education with representation from students to deal with this particular issue on campus. My colleague, the Minister responsible for the status of women, has instituted prevention grants, and I would in fact like to get the message out there to young people and old people alike that if they have an idea around preventing sexual violence, we're looking at funding those right now, so please apply. Thank you.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But one of the concerns is that with the university line at Dalhousie, it was a peer support organization or opportunity, Mr. Speaker. Those students who are on campus, and that helps immensely when you're dealing with sexualized violence, Mr. Speaker. It's estimated, unfortunately, that between 15 and 25% of North American college and university-age women will experience some form of sexual assault during their academic career, and that's a sad statistic, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotia is now lagging behind other provinces in Canada around legislation to improve campus safety. So I'm wondering if the minister would agree to bring forward legislation requiring universities and colleges, campuses to have sexual policies, student support, and public reporting like their Liberal counterparts have done in other provinces like Ontario and British Columbia.
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to let him know that the counsellors who are responding on 211 and 81, they're nurses and they're now trauma informed, Mr. Speaker. So I think that's will assist people who are calling those lines because of sexual violence. I do want to also let the honourable member know that the MOU that we've signed with universities does in fact require universities to have sexual assault policies easily accessible to young people. And Mr. Speaker, most important, we're tying increases in funding to making sure that those universities actually deal with sexual assault, that they have those particular policies in place.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, I asked the Minister of Municipal Affairs about illegal political contributions by Richmond County councillors. The minister deflected with what I consider unfair allegations about our party. And page 18 of the forensic audit by Grant Thornton says that, verbatim, a political party expense made by councillors relating to a Liberal Party event was claimed, and I can table that, Mr. Speaker. No political party, aside from the Liberals, is implicated in this forensic investigation. Mr. Speaker, having had 24 hours to consider his words, is the minister now willing to share which of his colleagues benefited from illegal contributions?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I know I speak on behalf of our party and every party. When donations are accepted, there is the full expectation that those donations are in line with the laws of the province. That is our expectation as a party. That is the Elections Nova Scotia's expectation of us. What I was speaking about yesterday was when it comes to expenses, all of us in this chamber meet with our municipal officials in our various ridings. We meet with various stakeholder communities. And I know that when there are expenses related to those meetings, we would expect that the rules be followed to a T. I know I speak on behalf of the member from Sydney River Myra Lewisburg, who participated in a meeting with Richmond that was expensed. I know I speak on behalf of the member from Northside Westmount, who participated in a meeting at the Red Stag that was expensed. I know I speak on behalf of the member for Argyle, who participated in a meeting that cost about $1,200 in Houston. Mr. Speaker, I know I speak on behalf of all of us when I say there is an expectation that the rules of the land are followed to a T. Nova Scotians demand that and expect no less.
Order, please. The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the minister's comments, but I'm trying to stay focused on one particular forensic investigation. I'm not talking about meals. I'm talking about donations. So the forensic auditors uncovered 7 instances where Richmond councillors were reimbursed for political contributions or tickets to political events, and I've already tabled that. So please, will the minister stay focused on this subject matter and tell taxpayers today that any contributions to Liberal politicians or Liberal political events will be returned to the people of Richmond County like it should be.
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to make it clear that forensic audit happened because of the actions taken by this government and the recommendations that came forward, Mr. Speaker. Our department has been very involved in the situation in that municipal unit. When it comes to any donations that have been received, obviously the expectation of everybody is that those donations come from individuals. In this particular case, Council decided to reimburse themselves for those donations. That is not allowed. That is against their policies, as I understand them, and those are against the laws of Elections Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. So obviously that situation needs to be dealt with, and our full expectation is that those laws always be followed.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Justice. Our caucus learned through a Freedom of Information request that the African Nova Scotians and Aboriginal people are overrepresented in provincial correctional facilities, and I will table that. I'm certain no one in this House wants to see either overrepresented in terms of time spent in segregation. However, I am concerned that the Department's lack of data may make it impossible to tell. So I ask the Minister, what assurances can she give this House that African Nova Scotians and Aboriginal people are not overrepresented in terms of time spent in segregation?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question. We have had some discussions earlier here in the House about segregation, and last week the member opposite brought up the issue around the veracity of the data that we have and whether or not it's sufficient. Our own staff had said it's not. We've looked at it. The individuals are tracked, and we can tell you individually how much time is spent in segregation, but it's not collated properly, and so we don't have accurate information. In response to that, Mr. Speaker, we are changing it, and within, well, I would say by the new year, we will be able to track and keep accurate information to respond to the member's question.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you to the Minister for that response. But when I asked the Minister last week about the use of segregation in correctional facilities, she said, and I quote, "We're certainly very aware of it in terms of mental health concerns." I'll table that. Yet, Mr. Speaker, the letter from her department that I tabled last week stated that they do not track the total time inmates spent in segregation, and I submit that this is not acceptable. People have recently spoken out in a number of provinces about the apparent lack of oversight regarding the use of segregation in correctional facilities. Mr. Speaker, it is good that the Minister has agreed to correct this problem, but I would like to ask this question. Why was there such fundamental such a lack of fundamental administrating tracking, and that has not happened until it may happen now?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, as Minister of Justice, I certainly do take responsibility for the work of our department, but some things have been let slide over many years. And when we find out about them, when we realize that's not something we're tracking, we're taking steps to correct it. It really was not something I was aware of, that we couldn't account for that until just recently. And I think even our staff, everybody in the department realizes it needs to change. And the focus as well on the issue about overrepresentation of African Nova Scotian and Aboriginal, I would like to just mention that under the inquiry into the Home for Coloured Children, which is restorative in nature, they are looking at all of our institutions and the overrepresentation within our systems and how we can do better in future. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Municipal Affairs. Page 32 of the Grant Thornton Forensic Audit reveals some disturbing expenses, and I'll table this page. It shows that on May 8, 2013, expenses of $546 were claimed for a reception and meal at 11 o'clock and an adult entertainment venue in Houston, Texas called Treasures. It's unbelievable, but this isn't the end of it. That same night, a receipt for $35 was submitted. The CAO originally said it was for a taxi, but the auditor found that it was for an adult entertainment establishment. So how outrageous do these expenses have to be before that it's time for this minister and his department to take firm action?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, I am disgusted by the expenses that were made. Obviously, I think I speak on behalf of everybody here in expressing shock and dismay that these expenses were made. But the issue at hand here is that individuals within a certain council who is independent and autonomous broke their own rules when it came to expenses, Mr. Speaker. That, of course, is unacceptable. It has led to a forensic audit that was pushed for by our department. It was flagged in a previous audit, and it has led to an RCMP investigation. Obviously, these matters are being taken very seriously, and it is incumbent upon all of us to allow the investigators to proceed to see what the final findings are of that particular case, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's just that we've been hearing from so many constituents in that area, and I think they felt that there should have been action taken sooner. Treasures is an upscale gentlemen's club in Houston, Texas, and it offers a range of corporate packages. The Silver VIP package costs $500 plus taxes and fees and includes 370 milliliters of premium liquor, 5 free admissions to the club, reserved seating on the main floor, and a VIP waitress. Has this minister investigated to make sure taxpayer money was not used to purchase a VIP corporate package in a Houston strip club?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, to expense any of that is absolutely ridiculous. It is against the rules of that municipal unit, and it should not have happened. It was in terrible taste, Mr. Speaker. The situation is so severe that the RCMP has brought in to investigate this, Mr. Speaker. We would not have had these findings if it was not for the red flags that came in on an audit that all municipalities are forced to give municipal affairs every year. There was issues flagged there. That led to our department to push for a forensic audit, which happened, and citizens applied directly to the Ombudsman's office to take a look at this, Mr. Speaker. So obviously these are problems, and the appropriate officials are looking at it, and investigations are happening, Mr. Speaker. There was rules that were broken. I think we all need to recognize that. It's not because of anybody in this room why those rules were broken, Mr. Speaker. So at the end of the day, we have to let this investigation proceed and come up with its conclusions, and if there's any information that comes from that suggests that we should act, of course we will.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, a question for the Minister of Municipal Affairs. Mr. Speaker, yesterday and twice today, the Minister said it was a recommendation sent by this government to the Municipal Council in Richmond that led to a forensic audit which revealed inappropriate spending practices. But, Mr. Speaker, is it true that the Minister allowed the audit to proceed under the supervision of the CAO and a councillor who was an employee of the Liberal caucus? Two of the individuals found responsible for the very inappropriate expenses that were being investigated.
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure if the member opposite is questioning the validity of the findings within that audit. They were consistent with the finding of the Ombudsman's office, Mr. Speaker. I think that is a good thing, that both investigations came up with very similar conclusions. Rules were broken by individuals, and there's further recommendations in both of those reports to inform the Richmond Council on how to better improve their own rules around expenses. Mr. Speaker, we are also taking this matter so seriously that it is helping us inform the broader conversation we're having with our municipal partners on expenses in general, and you will probably see some changes coming forward in the spring around municipal expenses. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not questioning the findings, but I am saying that there could be more. the individuals that were supervising the audit, to me, that's clearly inappropriate. Mr. Speaker, taxpayers in Richmond County are not satisfied. This government knew what was going on. An employee in their own caucus office is one of the councillors involved. Does the minister expect the taxpayers of Richmond County to be satisfied with the lack of support they received from this government in getting to the bottom of what was going on?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. That forensic audit was conducted by Grant Thornton, a reputable company who does these things for businesses, for governments across North America and beyond. And I have not been provided any information from that member or anybody else to question the findings of that report. This is an issue of individuals choosing to break the rules that Council had established for themselves. It's unacceptable. Every member of this chamber holds ourselves to the highest standards when it comes to transparency and accountability with our expenses. The public, I know, demands and expects all elected officials to do the same, Mr. Speaker. If we do need to change the laws of this land to ensure that that is happening and everybody is brought up to the standard that Nova Scotians expect and demand, we will do that, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the member from Dartmouth South asked the Minister of Health about the fees clients pay for long-term care. The Department of Health and Wellness is supposed to provide a 30-day notice for increases in fees to clients in long-term care, Mr. Speaker. New rates are expected to go up on November 1st. However, that didn't take place this year. They were given much shorter notice, so I'm wondering if the Minister could indicate why the Department chose not to follow the 30-day notice for increases in long-term care fees.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I know there was a delay from the Department. Perhaps part of it was due to the fact that there are no increases in rates for the next year.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
See, Mr. Speaker, some clients will see an increase. Last week, the Minister said there'd be no general increases, as he just mentioned, but the constituent that the member from Dartmouth South brought forward will see a fee increase and wasn't given that 30 days notice. However, that person's only source of income is the Guaranteed Income Supplement, or GIS, and it's a benefit through the federal government for low-income seniors. Is it the case that when the federal government increases GIS rates for low-income seniors, this government is going to claw that back through increased fees for those living in long-term care?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. We know that there can be changes in assessment of any individual because of a new source of income that they may get during the year, and that can indeed change. In terms of the accommodation rate, with no change being made, in fact, there was no need to, in fact, inform the members in our long-term facilities that there was no change. They did not actually have to be informed.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Energy. Mr. Speaker, the province is a shareholder in the Atlantic Lotteries Corporation, and the Minister is responsible for overseeing that investment on behalf of taxpayers. Today, the Auditor General released a report that highlighted a number of control weaknesses, and the Atlantic Lottery Corporation is known to host an annual Ministers' Summit for ministers from the shareholder provinces. Mr. Speaker, this is essentially a shareholders meeting where shareholders can ask questions and raise concerns. I'd like to ask the Minister, has he ever attended one of the Atlantic Lottery Corporation's Minister Summits?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I've had the opportunity to attend 2 of those summits. Last year we hosted here in Halifax, and this summer it was held, or this fall I should say, was held in Moncton at the offices of Atlantic Lottery Corporation. We take very serious the recommendations that came from the Auditor General's report. A lot of those predate my time as Minister, but regardless of that, we certainly want to make sure that the proper safeguards and transparency and accountability are in place for Atlantic Atlantic Lotto, as we expect from all of our government entities.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, having been to 2 of the ministers' summits, I'm curious as to what the minister was doing in his capacity there to protect the shareholders and their investment. Obviously, the Auditor General released a bunch of findings today about skyrocketing salaries there, a bunch of inappropriate investments. So I'd like to ask the minister, he was there in his capacity to protect the shareholders, which are the taxpayers of this province. What was he doing at these meetings? Was he looking at documents? Was he looking at the shareholder agreement? Was he asking any questions about what was happening?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, we have representatives that sit on the board. In fact, the CEO of the Nova Scotia Gaming Corporation sits on the ALC board along with another member representing the interest of Nova Scotians. Obviously, we have seen what the Auditor General has identified. If the member looks, most of those concerns predate my time as minister, but we take those very seriously. Speaker, one of the issues that was asked today as well is regarding entertainment by Atlantic Lotto, and I certainly acknowledge to the press when I received tickets from Atlantic Lotto. I'm wondering if the honourable member is willing to do the same for both himself, his colleagues, and even his political staff.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Very, very kind of the minister for that answer and response there. But what we're trying to talk about is what was the minister doing in his capacity to oversee this file. Today we learned that the Auditor General in his joint audit with the auditors from the other provinces found significant issues around a lack of government oversight and a lack of direction. And in fact, the Auditor General found that the Atlantic Lotteries Corporation had, without the government support, without shareholder support, proceeded with an $8 million investment in a startup company based in the UK, which resulted in an $8 million loss. So I'd like to ask the minister, when did he first learn about this investment? At which one of the minister's summits did he learn about it? And what action did he suggest to the Atlantic Lotteries Corporation at that time to make sure that this didn't happen again?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member is quick to ask questions. Apparently he's not so quick to answer questions, as I gave him ample opportunity there to be able to indicate whether he had received any hospitality from Atlantic Lotto or his colleagues or even his political staff. Apparently transparency only goes so far with that member. The points that he is raising predate our government to start off with. He may want to ask his colleagues over to the left on that, but the specific investment he's referring to was one that was made by both New Brunswick and PEI. Nova Scotia was not involved in that. To the credit of the previous administration, they did not commit Nova Scotia to that specific initiative of Atlantic Lotto. So the losses that he's referring to were...
Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. With the consent of the House, can we revert back to reports, regulations, and other papers? Is it agreed? It is agreed. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Leader of the Opposition raised a serious issue in the House around mental health in Cumberland County. I want to table a letter that I've sent to the CEO, Janet Knox, expecting that immediately they move on finding a better way to manage wait lists, particularly around mental health and addiction services. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for bringing it to the House, and we'll make sure that those Nova Scotians who are looking for mental health supports, Mr. Speaker, are treated in the way that I believe they should be, and this wasn't it.
The paper is tabled. We'll now move on to opposition business. The House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can we call private member